Imagine being trapped inside a cramped iron drum, heated to 122 degrees and filled with poisonous carbon monoxide. Now imagine someone beating on that drum with a giant sledgehammer for hours on end. It was in exactly this kind of hell that the crew of a KV-1 tank spent the longest day of their lives. This is not a story about the polished heroism found on propaganda posters. This is a story about how men bled from their ears due to the concussive noise, how they passed out from exhaust fumes yet continued to load their gun, transforming themselves into living robots. You will learn what it is like to repair a severed tank track while standing knee-deep in a swamp, with the ground around you boiling from machine gun fire. You will see how a gunner shuts down his humanity to cold-bloodedly destroy the enemy at point-blank range, and why, after destroying an entire battalion, these men looked not like victors, but like old men with empty eyes. You have to see this through to the end to understand the price of victory paid by the crew of Zinovy Kolobanov, and to learn why this engagement is still considered a unique case in world military history. August 18th, 1941, the Leningrad Front. This was no longer a war of maneuvers. This was the agony of defense. Army Group North was grinding through Soviet divisions like rotten straw. The mechanized wedges of the Wehrmacht were tearing toward Krasnogvardeysk. If this line fell, Leningrad would be caught in a pincer movement, and the city of millions would drown in blood. There was no room for a retreat strategy here. The command order was as dry as a handful of sand in the face. Stand to the death. But stand to the death is literature. In reality, it meant an engineering problem, turning 47.5 tons of steel into an immovable firing point capable of stopping an armored avalanche. Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov looked at the map. He wasn't looking for a place to be a hero. He was looking for a point where the physics of the landscape would work for him. The area of the Voiskovitsy State Farm. Here, among swamps and viscous soil, 3 roads converged. It wasn't just a crossroads. It was a bottleneck. German tank columns were tethered to the roads. 1 step to the left, 1 step to the right, and the tracks would sink into the quagmire up to the drive sprockets. Kolobanov understood. This was the perfect shooting gallery. The Germans would be forced to move in a column, exposing their flanks. He made a decision that looked like suicide, but was actually the highest form of tactical calculation. 1 heavy KV-1 tank against an entire division. The crew didn't discuss the odds. The crew went to work. The air hung heavy with the smell of overheated diesel and swamp rot. The KV-1 was a monster of Soviet tank engineering. Its armor featured 75 millimeters of cast steel on the front. This wasn't just protection. It was an argument that German 37-millimeter guns could not refute, even at point-blank range. But in an open field, this tank was a target. It had to be hidden. The back-breaking labor began. 5 men with shovels against cubic yards of hard, stony ground mixed with the roots of centuries-old trees. "Deeper," Kolobanov's voice sounded hollow, cutting through the clang of entrenching tools. "Bury the turret to the grass line." They were digging a hull-down position, a primary and an alternate. It wasn't just a pit. It was a grave for German hopes of a blitzkrieg. Driver-mechanic Nikolai Nikiforov drove the machine into the excavated trench. The multi-ton behemoth settled obediently into the earth. Now, the KV-1 was a pillbox. From the outside, only the turret and the barrel of the 76mm F-32 gun were visible. This gun was a surgeon's scalpel. The muzzle velocity of its armor-piercing shell was 662 meters per second. At a range of 500 meters, it would punch clean through any German armor of that period. The heat was unbearable. The August sun baked the backs of their heads, sweat poured into their eyes and stung the scrapes on their hands. Tunics were soaked with salt and grease, but no one stopped. Every extra minute of work meant an extra percentage of probability of survival. Gunner Andrei Usov wiped the optics of his sight. His movements were economical and precise. He knew that tomorrow he would have to look through this sight at death coming straight for him. Usov was an artillery sniper. His eye was the crew's only hope that the first shot would be fatal. Camouflage, Kolobanov commanded. Branches, sod, and patches of moss were put to use. The tank had to dissolve into the landscape. They broke up the silhouette of the turret, blurred it, turned it into part of the hill. The Germans loved order. They were used to seeing the enemy. But tomorrow they would see only muzzle flashes from nowhere. Radio operator loader Pavel Kiselkov stacked the shells. Armor-piercing, high-explosive fragmentation, 114 rounds. Each shell weighed over 13 pounds. Kiselkov shifted them, checking the primers. In the cramped turret of the KV, where the temperature rose above 100 degrees, every movement required effort. But he knew, when the fight started, there would be no time for fatigue. He would have to feed shells into the breach with the speed of an automatic loader. Loader Nikolai Rodenkov checked the DT machine guns. The drums had to be close at hand. If the German infantry attacked, these machine guns would be the last line of defense. 7.62 millimeters of lead rain. The position was chosen brilliantly. On one side, a swamp. On the other, a forest. The road was visible for a kilometer in both directions. 2 landmarks. 2 birch trees at the intersection. Kolobanov designated them as reference points. Landmark 1, intersection. Range, 300. Landmark 2, turn at the tree line. Range, 600, he barked, checking the map. No electronics, no ballistic computers. Only eyesight, experience, and the firing table burned into memory. Kolobanov calculated the sectors of fire. He mentally played out the battle scenario. First, the lead vehicle, then the rear guard. Lock the column in, create a traffic jam, and then methodically shoot up the panic-stricken metal. This was the cruel arithmetic of war. There was no room for pity here, only the efficiency of target destruction. The sun began to dip toward sunset. The tank was completely hidden. Even from 10 paces, it was hard to distinguish it from a bump on the edge of the woods. The engine was killed. The 12-cylinder V2K diesel cooled, the metal ticking. Silence descended on Voiskovitsi. It was a deceptive, ominous silence. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the engines of German Panzers were already roaring. 22 tanks against 1. A ratio of 1 to 22. Any tactics textbook would call this madness. Kolobanov called it work. The crew sat on the armor, greedily gulping the cooling air. They didn't talk about home or families. Those thoughts were dead weight right now. They talked about mechanisms, about track tension, about the quality of the shells. The breech block is stiff, Usov noted, wiping his hands with a rag. Greased it, Kiselkov answered shortly. It'll work. They knew the KV-1 had its flaws. The transmission was a weak point. The main clutch could burn out during a sharp maneuver. Visibility from the tank was atrocious. The commander's panoramic sight gave a narrow field of view. They were practically blind. But they had armor, and they had orders. Night covered the position. Inside the tank, it was dark and cramped. The smell of burnt gunpowder hadn't appeared yet, but it already tickled their nostrils like a phantom. The men tried to sleep in snatches, right on the ammo rack. The sleep was ragged, light. Every rustle of the forest made them flinch. Their psyches were pulled taut as a steel cable ready to snap. The fear was there. Only fools aren't afraid. But here, fear was forged into concentration. They knew. There was no right to make a mistake. The first miss would unmask the position. The second miss would cost them their lives. Kolobanov didn't sleep. He listened to the night. He waited for the sound that would change everything. The sound of foreign tracks grinding up Russian earth. Tomorrow, this place would be hell. But tonight, there were only 5 men and 47 tons of cold steel buried in the ground. The trap was set. The snare was ready to snap shut. The engineering problem was solved. All that remained was to pull the trigger. The silence pressed on the eardrums harder than the roar of an artillery barrage. The night inside the metal box of the KV-1 stretched like thick, cold tar. This was not a time for sleep. This was the time when the human psyche passed through the meat grinder of waiting. Inside the combat vehicle, the air was stale, heavy, saturated with the smells of oil, diesel, and unwashed bodies. 5 men sat in the dark, listening to the 47-ton giant cool down. The metal clicked, contracting after the day's heat. Each click sounded like a pistol shot to the temple. The crew didn't speak. All words had already been spoken, all orders received. Only the physiology of fear and professional deformation remained. Driver-mechanic Nikiforov's fingers cramped on the levers, even though the tank stood motionless. It was phantom tension. He was mentally driving every meter of tomorrow's maneuver, checking the clutch operation in his head, recalling the terrain he had seen through the narrow slit of the vision block. Gunnar Usov didn't take his eyes off the sight, even though nothing was visible in the dark. It was a habit. It was a way to maintain control over reality. His eye had to merge with the optics, become part of the optical system. The hours ticked by agonizingly slowly. Every minute was a test of will. The scariest thing in war isn't the battle. The scariest thing is the final hours before the battle, when imagination paints pictures of your own death. But here, in the ambush near Voiskovitsi, there was no place for panic. There was only cold, angry focus. Kolobanov looked at the glowing hands of his watch. 4 in the morning. 5. Dawn began to seep through the slits, gray, foggy, damp. Along with the dawn came the sound. First, it was a barely perceptible trembling of the ground. The vibration transmitted through the tank's floor, through the steel hull, straight into the crew's bones. Then came the drone. It wasn't the roar of Soviet diesels. It was the characteristic, high-pitched sound of German gasoline Maybach engines. It grew, filling all the space around them, drowning out the birdsong and the wind. The sound of an approaching steel avalanche. "Engines!" Loder Kiselkov said shortly. His voice was raspy but calm. German motorcyclists raced down the road. Reconnaissance. They were moving at high speed, kicking up fountains of spray from the puddles. Black raincoats, helmets, machine guns on sidecars. They felt like the masters of this land. They didn't even look around carefully. Why? The Russians were beaten. The Russians were running. The Wehrmacht was marching on Leningrad like it was a parade. Kolobanov gave the sign. Hold fire. Let them pass. If they destroyed the recon unit, the main column would stop, deploy, and call in air support. Aviation was death for a KV. They needed the patience of a poker player holding a royal flush while keeping a stone face. The motorcycles disappeared around the bend. The drone intensified. Now it sounded like continuous thunder. From behind the small forest, the head of the column crawled out. The first tank appeared in Usov's sight. It was a Panzer 35T, a Czechoslovak machine in the service of the Reich, a light tank. Its armor consisted of riveted plates only 25 millimeters thick. For the KV-1's 76mm shell, this wasn't even armor. It was cardboard. But there were many of them. Very many. Behind the first tank crawled a second, a third, a fourth. The column seemed like an endless snake covered in gray dust. 22 vehicles, 22 crews who didn't know they were already dead. They moved in a tight formation, the distance between vehicles minimal. It was a mistake. A gross tactical error born of overconfidence. The Germans had their hatches open. The tank commanders stuck out of the turret hatches, exposing their faces to the morning sun. Someone was smoking. Someone was chewing. They weren't in combat readiness. They were on the march. Their guns were pointed straight ahead, muzzle covers removed, but no one looked at the suspicious hill by the road. For Kolobanov, this picture was an open book. He didn't see people. He saw targets. He saw vulnerable spots, thin sides, vertical armor plates, open viewing slits. The technical specs of the German tanks scrolled through his head instantly. The 37mm Skoda gun was powerless against the KV's frontal armor at any range. They couldn't penetrate the Soviet giant. But they could blow off a track. They could jam the turret. They could blind the optics. 22 barrels meant a squall of fire that could turn the tank into a blind, deaf cripple. "Armor-piercing," Kolobanov commanded. His voice was quiet, metallic. No shouting. The tank intercom was working, but they could hear each other without headphones. They felt their comrades' tension through their skin. Kiselkov rammed the shell into the breach. The clang of the breech block sounded like a sentence. That sound cut off the way back. Now the KV-1 was a cocked hammer. Usov turned the traversing wheels. The crosshairs of the sight crawled smoothly over the hull of the lead German tank. He chose the point of impact. Not the turret, the hull, below the turret ring, to ensure the ammo rack detonated. The range closed. 300 meters. 250. The Germans came closer, filling the entire field of view. They were so close you could make out the numbers on the sides, the tactical division markings, the faces of the tankers. This was the moment of truth. Nerves vibrated like a taut string. The instinct of self-preservation screamed, "Shoot now!" Fear whispered, "Run!" But discipline kept hands steady. They had to let them get to point-blank range. They needed the entire column to get pulled into the defile between the swamps. They needed to slam the coffin lid so no one could get out. "Landmark 1, lead vehicle, direct fire," Kolobanov whispered. Seconds stretched into eternity. Time became viscous. The heartbeat echoed in temples like a hammer. Usov held his breath. The aiming mark froze on the center of the German cross on the side of the lead tank. His finger lay on the trigger. At that moment, everything in the world vanished. Birds, wind, sun, future, past. Only the crosshairs and the gray steel of enemy armor remained. The German column continued to move. Tracks clanked, motors roared. They were carrying death for Leningrad in their bellies. But here, on a narrow road amidst the swamps, they met their fate. A fate weighing 47 tons, covered in branches and sod. The psychological torture of waiting was over. The time for the physics of destruction had arrived. "Fire!" Kolobanov exhaled. The crack of the 76mm gun tore the morning silence like the crack of a whip. The 47-ton body of the KV-1 shuddered, rocking back on its shock absorbers. Inside the turret, the clang of the breech ejecting the smoking casing mixed with the hollow echo of the shot. Andrei Usov didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He knew the physics of his gun. At a range of 150 meters, it was impossible to miss. The lead German tank, marching at the head of the column, seemed to hit an invisible wall. The BR-350A armor-piercing shell punched through its frontal armor like paper. The explosion of the ammunition inside the cramped hull of the light tank happened instantly. The turret was ripped from its ring and thrown into the ditch. A pillar of fire erupted from the hatches. The machine turned into a torch, blocking the only solid road through the swamp.
"Ready!"
shouted Loader Kiselkov, ramming in the next shell. His hands worked faster than his thoughts. This was muscle memory, drilled hundreds of times on the training grounds. "Shift fire! Tail of the column!" Kolobanov's voice cut the air. No joy, no triumph, only cold calculation. To shut the trap, they had to hammer in the cork at both ends. If they didn't destroy the rear guard now, the Germans could reverse and escape. Usov furiously spun the turret traverse wheel. The electric drive hummed, turning the heavy steel head of the tank to the left. The sides of German vehicles flashed in the sight. They were still moving on inertia. They hadn't realized what had happened yet. They thought the lead tank had hit a mine. "Trailing vehicle, in the crosshairs," Usov reported. Second shot. The tracer drew a short line and bit into the engine compartment of the last tank in the column. The engine flared up. Gasoline flooded the transmission. The tank halted, shrouded in black smoke. The trap had snapped shut. 20 combat vehicles were locked on a narrow strip of road between the forest and the bog. They couldn't go forward. The lead tank was burning. They couldn't go back. The rear tank was burning. Chaos erupted in the German column. This was no longer a disciplined march of victors. It was the panic of a herd driven to slaughter. German tank commanders darted in their hatches, trying to figure out where the fire was coming from. They didn't see the flashes. Soviet gunpowder produced little smoke, and the thick brush and camouflage reliably hid the KV-1. The Germans began firing wildly at the forest, at the bushes, at each other. Their shells shredded the foliage, but found no target. Kolobanov watched this through the commander's panoramic sight. He saw one of the German Panzers try to turn in place. The tracks tore up the sod, and the heavy machine began to slide, slowly but inevitably, into the swamp. The greasy black mud sucked in the road wheels. The engine roared at maximum RPMs, but the tank bottomed out. It was immobilized. It was no longer a combat unit. It was just a pile of metal. "High explosive! On the infantry!" Kolobanov commanded. German tankers and troops riding on the armor tried to jump off, taking cover behind the wheels of the vehicles, lying flat in the ditches. Kiselkov changed the shell type. A high-explosive fragmentation grenade flew into the center of the cluster of German vehicles. The explosion threw up earth and shrapnel. The infantry pressed into the ground, unable to raise their heads. They were cut off from their tanks. Tanks are blind without infantry. Now the methodical work began. Like a shooting gallery, Usov shifted the sight from one machine to another. The range was pistol close. The penetrating power of the F-32 gun was excessive for this target. The KV's shells punched through the German tanks cleanly, tearing out chunks of armor on the opposite side. "Shot!" The tank shuddered again. "Hit! Burning!" Kolobanov recorded. "Next! Armor piercing!" Inside the KV turret, a unique rhythm was established. The clang of the breech, the clang of the casing hitting the floor, the click of the lock. Command. Shot. The ventilator couldn't cope with the powder gases. Blue-gray smoke began to accumulate under the turret roof, stinging eyes, scratching throats. But no one paid attention. Adrenaline drowned out the discomfort. The German tanks tried to maneuver in the tight space. They collided, crushed each other's fenders, smashed headlights. Two vehicles locked tracks and froze, turning into one big target. Usov sent a shell right into the joint between them. The explosion tore both machines apart. The turret of one tank flew into the air, somersaulting, and fell into the swamp with a heavy splash. This was not a fight of equals. It was a massacre. The German 37mm guns finally spotted the flashes on the hill. They turned their turrets toward the KV. Return fire began. Shells hammered the armor of the Soviet tank. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was sharp, unpleasant, like being inside a bucket struck by a hammer. But the armor held. 75mm of hardened steel laughed at the German caliber. "Commander, they're hitting us!" the radio operator shouted, not stopping the supply of shells. "Let them hit. It's just peas," Kolobanov answered calmly, though everything inside him clenched with every impact. He knew. Not all shells were equal. If the Germans brought up artillery, everything would change. But for now, it was a duel between a sledgehammer and tin cans. The temperature in the fighting compartment rose. Heat radiated from the gun breech like an open oven. The tankers' faces were black with soot. Sweat traced light paths through it. Hands slipped on the metal of the shells. Kiselkov tore the skin on his knuckles, ramming another charge home, but felt no pain. Pain would come later. Right now, there was only function. Take the shell, ram it, close the breach. Outside, it was hell. Not 2 or 3 tanks were burning now. A dozen were burning. Black, greasy smoke from burning rubber tires and diesel fuel blocked out the sun. The flames roared, devouring the machinery. Ammo racks in the destroyed vehicles began to cook off. Series of explosions merged into a continuous rumble. Flying shrapnel shredded tree branches, fell into the swamp, and rattled against the armor of the neighboring, still intact machines. Another German tank, trying to escape the shelling, drove off the embankment and flipped over. Its tracks spun helplessly in the air. The crew tried to escape through the escape hatch, but a burst from Rodenkov's machine gun pinned them back to the ground. "Armor piercing! Center of the column!" Kolobanov commanded. Usov worked like a robot. Traverse. Fine-tune aim. Shot. He didn't think about the people inside those machines. To him, they were targets. Iron boxes that had to be cracked open and burned. If he started thinking that there were living people in there, who had mothers and children, he wouldn't be able to pull the trigger. He shut off empathy. He left only professionalism. 20 minutes of combat. 20 minutes of continuous firing. The casings on the turret floor were already getting in the way of their feet. They had to kick them aside. The air became bitter and hot. It was hard to breathe. But the rate of fire didn't drop. Kolobanov understood. You couldn't give the enemy time to recover. They had to finish them off. They had to turn this column into a pile of scrap metal that would rust in the Russian swamps forever. Another shell hit the side of a Panzer II. The armor there was only 15 millimeters thick. The shell punched through it, flew right through, knocked out the engine, and exited the other side. The tank flared up like a matchbox. "Got him!" Usov exhaled. Around the KV, the ground was churned up by return hits and mortar shells. The camouflage had long since been blown away. The tank stood naked, black, menacing. But it continued to spew fire, remaining invulnerable to the enemy's light guns. It was a triumph of Soviet design. It was a triumph of a crew that had become one with the machine. The slaughter at Wojskowice continued, and the count of destroyed hardware grew with every minute. The battle had been going on for more than an hour. Inside the turret of the heavy KV-1 tank, time ceased to exist as a linear value. It was compressed into an endless cycle. Load, aim, fire, recoil shock. The air in the fighting compartment had turned into a poisonous jelly. The standard ventilator buzzing under the turret roof couldn't keep up. It just circulated the red-hot mixture of powder gases, gasoline vapors, and human sweat. A blue haze hung in a dense fog, stinging eyes to tears. There was nothing to breathe. Every breath was a gulp of carbon monoxide, slowly but surely killing the crew. Outside, the methodical destruction of the enemy continued, but inside the steel box, a different, invisible battle was unfolding. A battle of physiology against limit loads. The temperature inside the tank had crossed 120 degrees. The metal of the breech was so hot that an accidental touch left a burn. The tunics on the fighters had long been soaked through, turned dark, and stuck to their bodies. Sweat flooded their faces, stung their eyes, mixing with soot. But there was no time to wipe it off. Hands were busy with death. Loader Pavel Kiselkov was the engine of this fight. He was no longer a human, he was a function. His task was to lift a heavy shell from the floor, turn it in the cramped space without hitting the breech or the commander, and ram it into the barrel. And do this dozens of times in a row. The muscles of his back and arms were filled with lead. His fingers trembled from overexertion. Carbon monoxide began to take effect. Movements became slow. Dark circles swam before his eyes. Blood pounded in his temples. Kiselkov staggered, grabbing the brackets of the ammo rack. "Pasha, stay awake!" Kolobanov's shout broke through the ringing in his ears. The commander saw the loader's condition. He understood. If Kiselkov passed out, the tank would be disarmed. The rate of fire would drop to 0. Kiselkov shook his head, spraying sweat. He forced himself to move. This wasn't willpower anymore. It was a reflex hammered in by years of training. Grab, ram, close, recoil, eject. Grab a new one. His consciousness narrowed to the size of the breech. He worked on autopilot, balancing on the edge of fainting. But the scariest thing wasn't the heat or the gases. The scariest thing was the sound. The German tanks, realizing they were facing a fortress, concentrated their fire on the KV. Shells from 37mm and 50mm guns hailed onto the armor. The armor held. Soviet steel was alloyed and hardened to perfection. German slugs ricocheted, leaving deep pockmarks, or shattered into dust. But the energy of the impact didn't disappear. Every hit was a blow from a giant sledgehammer on the hull. Inside the tank, it felt like a physical blow to the entire body. The sound of impact wasn't a ring. It was a monstrous crash that burst capillaries in the nose and made ears bleed. Eardrums refused to process this hell. The men opened their mouths to equalize pressure, but it helped little. The vibration from the blows shook dust off mechanisms, tore mounts loose, punched kidneys and livers.
112,
driver-mechanic Nikiforov counted to himself. He felt the blows with his back pressed against the armored seatback. Another shell hit squarely on the gun mantlet. The tank shuddered like a living creature that had been slapped. A shower of sparks inside the turret. Scale poured down their collars. For a second it seemed the turret was jammed. Usov yanked the wheel with force. It moved. Heavily, with a screech, but it moved. The traverse mechanism was damaged, but still alive.
"They're aiming for the vision blocks. Blind them,"
Usov rasped. The Germans were trying to blind the monster. Periscopes cracked from near misses and direct bullet hits. Visibility narrowed to murky spots of light. Kolobanov was pressed against the panoramic sight. He saw the world in fragments, the burning carcass of a Panzer, running figures of infantry, the flash of a shot. He needed to assemble a complete picture of the battle from these fragments. His brain worked like a computer, ignoring the headache and nausea. "High explosive, right of landmark 2, infantry with grenades," he commanded. Kiselkov found the right shell by touch. The smoke ate at his eyes. He could barely see anything. His hands slipped. The heavy slug slipped, hitting his leg. Pain pierced his consciousness, sobering him for a second. He growled, snatched up the shell, and furiously rammed it into the barrel. The breech clanged. Shot. The casing fell to the floor, ringing against dozens of other empty casings. There was nowhere to put them anymore. They rolled underfoot, made it hard to stand, burned through boots. The tank was as cramped as a coffin. The confined space pressed on the psyche. There was nowhere to run. There was no cover. Your skin was the armor. Your life depended on millimeters of steel. The crew felt buried alive. The fear of claustrophobia mixed with the fear of death, creating a cocktail of madness. But they suppressed it. They turned fear into hatred. 135, Nikiforov whispered after a series of hits on the side. The armor hummed like a bell. Nuts inside the driving compartment were unscrewing from the constant vibrations. Nikiforov held the lever with one hand and tightened the vision hatch mounts with the other. He knew. If the hatch blew off, the shockwave and shrapnel would burst inside. The KV-1 had turned into a red-hot furnace where characters were reforged. There was no place for the weak here. A weak man would simply die of heart failure or go insane. Only professionals remained. Men who knew how to shut off emotions and turn on function. Kolobanov, Usov, Kiselkov, Rodenkov, Nikiforov. 5 men who had become one mechanism. They were not poster heroes. They were black with soot, deafened, exhausted to the limit laborers of war. Their job was to kill and survive under a hail of steel. "Commander, the sight is fogging up," Usov reported. Optics were clogged with dust and soot. "Work off the barrel. Aim through the bore if you have to," Kolobanov answered. He didn't let them relax. He kept the rhythm. If they stopped for even a minute, exhaustion would cover them over their heads, and they wouldn't get up again. Only action. Only work. An explosion outside was particularly strong. The tank was tossed up. The light in the turret flickered and went out. Darkness. Only the red embers of smoldering rags and flashes of outside fire breaking through the slits. "Emergency lighting!" Kolobanov shouted. No one panicked. Hands found toggle switches in the dark. A dim bulb lit up. In its yellow light, the tankers' faces looked like death masks. Eyes sunken, mouths open, gasping for air. On the floor, among the casings, lay Kiselkov. He was on his knees, leaning his head against the breech. He was vomiting. Carbon monoxide was doing its work. "Kolya, swap out!" Kolobanov nodded to the assistant driver. Rodenkov dropped his machine gun and grabbed the loader under the arms, dragging him to the ventilation grate on the floor. There was a little more air there. He took the place of the breech himself. The conveyor belt of death could not stop, not for a second. Outside on the tank's armor, they would later count 157 impact marks. 157 times death knocked, but couldn't enter. The armor held. The welds didn't crack. The cast turret didn't split. It was a triumph of Soviet metallurgy. But did the people hold? The people inside this steel box aged 10 years in those 2 hours. Their souls were burned just like their faces. But the battle wasn't over. The enemy was still snapping back, and as long as the enemy was alive, The KV-1 would shoot, even if the crew had to do it from the grave. Silence fell on the swamp suddenly, as if someone had flipped the switch of war. A second ago, the world was being torn apart by the roar of the 76mm gun and the screech of shrapnel. And now, a vacuum. A dense, painful ringing stood in the tanker's ears. It was concussion silence. It pressed on the eardrums from the inside, preventing them from understanding. Were they alive or not? The engine was killed. The ventilator made its last strained revolutions and froze. Kolobanov pushed the heavy commander's hatch. The metal burned his palms. The hatch yielded reluctantly, as if it didn't want to let the outside world into this smoke-filled purgatory. Fresh air burst inside the turret, not as salvation, but as a blow. It was too clean, too cold compared to the suffocating gas inside. The commander climbed out onto the armor. His legs wouldn't hold him. His knees trembled with a fine, nasty shake. The adrenaline was leaving. He leaned his hand on the red-hot turret and looked ahead. A surreal picture spread out before him.
The road to Voiskovitsi had turned into a graveyard of machinery. 22 German tanks, 22 torches. Black columns of smoke rose vertically, propping up the August sky. It wasn't just destroyed equipment, it was a chaos of twisted metal. Turrets, torn off by ammo explosions, lay in the ditches like severed heads. Tracks, unspooled and torn, snaked through the mud. Tongues of flame shot from the open hatches of German machines, devouring the insides. The smell was monstrous, a mix of burnt gunpowder, melting rubber, diesel fuel, and the sweet, sickening scent of roasted meat. The crew climbed out. They looked like miners coming up from a collapsed shaft. Faces black with soot, only the whites of their eyes and teeth visible. You could wring out their tunics. Usov sat right on the turret, legs dangling. He looked at the work of his hands and didn't believe it. His brain refused to process the scale of destruction. 22 tanks. An entire tank battalion ceased to exist in 1 hour.
"Comes!" Kolobanov rasped. His throat was dry. His voice sounded like sandpaper grating. The radio operator descended back into the hell of the fighting compartment. He had to report to HQ. The airwaves crackled with static. "Topol, this is Kremen. Mission accomplished. Enemy stopped. Destroyed 22 units of armor. No losses. Over." A pause hung on the other end of the line. A long, incredulous pause. The battalion headquarters was kilometers away, in the safety of dugouts and maps. There, war looked like blue and red arrows on paper. There were standards, regulations, and common sense. And common sense said that one tank cannot destroy 22. It was impossible. It was a mistake. Or a lie. "Kremen, repeat the number. Are you drunk? Repeat the number!" The duty officer's voice cracked into a scream. He thought the crew had gone mad with fear and was now spouting nonsense. Repeating in words, 22 tanks. "Burning on the road, waiting for further instructions," the radio operator answered calmly, with icy intonation. He didn't care about the hysterics in his headphones. He had burning evidence right before his eyes. In the HQ, panic gave way to stupor. The battalion commander didn't believe it. The number was too huge to be true. It broke all statistics, all reports. If it was true, it wasn't a battle. It was a miracle. And only idiots believe in miracles in war. The division commander, General Baranov, demanded a car. He had to see it himself. He had to make sure Kolobanov hadn't abandoned the position and wasn't making up heroic deeds to cover a retreat. Half an hour later, a sedan drove up to the positions. Staff officers and a cameraman got out. They walked cautiously, crouching, although there was no shooting. They were afraid. But when they came out to the edge of the woods, they froze. The picture that opened up before them didn't fit in their minds. A field littered with burning iron, smoke covering the horizon. And against the backdrop of this apocalypse stood a single KV-1. It was covered in pockmarks from hits. The paint was burned off, the fenders bent, the antenna mount shot away. But it was whole. It stood like a monolith, like a cliff against which a wave had shattered. General Baranov walked up to the tank. He looked at Kolobanov, who had climbed down from the armor and was trying to stand at attention, but the general waved his hand. To hell with regulations. Other laws operated here now. He silently walked along the column of destroyed German machines. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 10, 15. He reached the turn and came back. His face, usually stern and impenetrable, expressed a mixture of shock and awe. He saw the marks on the KV's armor. He understood what had happened here. He saw the dents from slugs that could have killed the crew 157 times, but didn't.
This was a conflict of two realities. The paper logic of war, where losses are written off by formulas, and the rough, dirty truth of combat, where 5 men did the work of an entire artillery battery. "Did you count them?" Kolobanov asked quietly, not looking at the general. He looked at his hands. They were still trembling. "I counted, Zinovy Grigorievich," the general answered. There were no commanding notes in his voice. There was the respect of a man for a man who had looked over the edge of the abyss and returned. The cameraman bustled about, trying to film a panorama. He asked the tankers to pose. "Smile, heroes!" he shouted, aiming the lens. But no one smiled. The crew's faces were frozen masks of fatigue. Their eyes were empty. There was no triumph of victors in them. Only the fire was reflected in them. They had seen burning men trying to crawl out of German tanks. They finished them off with machine guns. It was work. Dirty, bloody work. And now, when the adrenaline was gone, a monstrous weight descended. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors. "Ammo is almost empty, Comrade General," Kolobanov reported. "We need resupply, and fuel, and mechanics to look at the running gear." He talked about business, about logistics. For him, the battle was over. The routine of machine maintenance had begun. The general nodded. He understood that medals, ranks, newspaper articles, all that would come later. And none of it mattered to these men right now. They needed to eat, sleep, and load new shells. Because the war wasn't over. 22 carcasses were just the beginning. Just the first act of the drama. The enemy was stunned, but not broken. Army Group North was huge. They had thousands of tanks. And they would come again. The crew knew it. The general knew it. Against the background of burning German iron, amidst the smoke and soot, a strange scene took place. Men from headquarters, in clean uniforms, looked at the tankers like aliens. And the tankers looked right through them. The wall between those who send men to death and those who kill had never been so transparent and so solid at the same time. "Record in the combat log," Baranov commanded his adjutant. 22 tanks, confirmed." The adjutant wrote. The pencil scratched on the paper. This sound seemed inappropriately loud in the dead silence of the burnt field. History was recorded. But for Kolobanov's crew, these were just numbers. Their reality was the smell of burning that had eaten into their skin and couldn't be washed off with anything. Their reality was waiting for the next fight. Because they knew, fate does not forgive such victories.
luck would have to be paid for, and the bill would be presented very soon. August 19th, 1941. The euphoria of victory is the most dangerous drug in war. It dulls vigilance, makes you believe in your own immortality. But the Wehrmacht is not an organization that forgives mistakes or ignores lessons. The German command analyzed the slaughter of the previous day. They realized sending light tanks to the slaughter against a KV-1 was economic and tactical madness. Tactics changed instantly. Instead of a cavalry charge, a methodical siege began. The morning didn't start with birdsong or the roar of engines. It started with a heavy, low whistle that made blood run cold. This sound is unmistakable. That's how large-caliber death flies. Air! There was no time to shout. Impact. It wasn't the ringing clang of 37mm shells. It was a dull, guttural thud that shook the earth meters deep. Next to the tank, a pillar of black earth and fire rose up. Shrapnel the size of a palm slashed the armor, leaving deep furrows. The Germans had brought up field artillery, 105mm howitzers, and anti-aircraft guns of 88mm caliber, the only weapon heavy tank crews truly feared. The 8.8 shell didn't just pierce armor, it smashed it, carrying energy inside that turned the crew into ground meat. "Sector 30, flashes by the forest," the observer shouted. Silhouettes of new machines appeared on the horizon. These weren't Czech tin cans anymore. These were Panzer IVs, medium support tanks. Their short-barreled 75mm guns didn't have high penetration, but they fired high-explosive shells packed with powerful explosives. Their task wasn't to penetrate, but to concuss, blow a track, jam the turret, blind the observation devices. The mammoth hunt had begun. Inside the KV-1, the atmosphere changed instantly. The icy calm of yesterday was replaced by the nervous tension of a cornered beast. Now it was a duel. The one-sided slaughter was over. "Driver, short reverse! Don't stay still!" Kolobanov commanded. Nikiforov yanked the levers. The tank, roaring with its diesel, jerked back, leaving the zeroed-in spot. A second later, a shell fell on the place where they had stood. The blast wave hit the frontal armor. The lights went out inside the tank. The bulb burst from the vibration. "Usov, landmark, burnt lead tank, right 40, see it?" "See it. Gun in position, gun shield." "Fire!" The KV's shot was drowned in the roar of an incoming explosion. Usov's shell landed precisely, scattering the German gun crew. But there were many of them. Too many for one machine. The Germans worked competently. They caught the tank in a pincer, firing from different ranges. The armor of the KV-1, which yesterday seemed like absolute protection, began to show signs of fatigue. Welds were experiencing colossal stress. From the constant impacts of heavy slugs, scale flew off inside the hull. Small, razor-sharp pieces of metal cut the tankers' faces. Blood mixed with sweat.
"Turret jamming!" Usov's voice sounded alarmed.
Another hit struck the turret ring. The rotation mechanism worked in jerks, with a terrible grinding noise. The electric motor howled, trying to turn the multi-ton structure against the resistance of twisted metal. Now, to catch a target, the driver had to turn the hull of the entire tank. That meant losing seconds, and seconds now were the currency of life. "Turn left! More! Stop!" the gunner commanded. The KV-1 snapped back. 76mm of steel and fire flew in response. Another Panzer IV flared up, taking a hit in the side. But the Germans didn't retreat. They smelled blood. They saw that the Russian Colossus had slowed down, that it was wounded. The density of fire increased. Shells drummed on the roof, on the gun mantlet, on the sides. It was like being inside a huge bell being beaten with sledgehammers from all sides. The crew began to suffer from oxygen starvation. The ventilation couldn't handle the powder gases from firing and the products of explosions outside. Heads were heavy, thoughts viscous. But there was no fear. There was anger. Animal, primal anger at these gray ants who dared to scratch their armor.
Load, Pasha! Faster!
Kolobanov urged. Kiselkov worked at the limit of human capability. His hands were bloody, nails torn off on the metal of the casing bases. He slipped on spent casings, fell, hitting his shoulder on the breech, but jumped up immediately. He knew. As long as the gun fired, they were alive. As soon as the gun fell silent, the Germans would come close and burn them with thermite or throw grenades. The situation changed radically. Yesterday, they were hunters in an ambush. Today, they were game shooting back. Maneuver space was shrinking. The swamp limited movement. The forest was shot through. They were pinned. An explosion of monstrous force shook the tank. The machine was tossed up. The crew was thrown against each other. The hit struck the running gear. The sound of tearing metal drowned out even the artillery roar. A clang, a screech, and the silence of the engine changed. RPMs rose, but there was no movement. The tank jerked and froze, listing to the right side. Nikiforov pressed the gas, pulled the turn lever. Useless. The machine spun in place, churning mud with one track. "Track!" he shouted. "Right track is cut!" It was a death sentence. An immobile tank is a dead tank. That's an axiom of tank warfare. Kolobanov realized it instantly. A cold needle of realization pierced his brain. The duel was over. The fight for survival had begun. They had become a stationary target under the sights of dozens of barrels. The KV-1's armor was no longer a guarantee. Now, these were just the walls of a crypt the Germans were methodically trying to crack open.
Don't panic!
The commander's voice was hard as a whip crack.
Usov, all-around observation. Fire at flashes. Nikiforov, kill the engine. Listen to the ground.
In the ensuing relative silence, they could hear shrapnel ticking against the armor outside. But something else was scarier. Through the ringing in their ears, they heard the sound of German infantry, commands in a foreign language, the thud of boots. They were coming to finish off the wounded beast. Now the war shrank to grenade-throwing distance. The escalation of violence reached its peak. The machine had done all it could. Now everything depended only on the men and their readiness to die, but not surrender. Critical situation. A tank deprived of mobility is no longer a combat unit. It is a steel coffin awaiting a welder with a torch. The right track of the KV-1 was torn. The heavy ribbon, weighing tons, lay in the mud like a dead snake. The road wheels spun helplessly in the air, grinding emptiness. The German artillerymen saw this. They understood. The beast was wounded. The intensity of fire increased multifold. Now they weren't shooting for luck. They were shooting for the kill. Shells landed closer and closer to the engine compartment. If they punched through the rear and lit the tanks, the crew would burn alive. Inside the turret, the decision was made in a split second. No discussions, no requests. This was pure survival mechanics. To live, they had to move. To move, they had to connect the torn metal. "Nikiforov, get out!" Kolobanov's order sounded dry, like a bolt click. "Rodenkov, after him. Sledgehammer and tensioner. Usov, fire on all landmarks. Don't let them raise their heads."
Driver mechanic Nikolai Nikiforov knew what that meant. He had to leave the protective capsule of armor. He had to go out where the air consisted of lead and shrapnel. He grabbed the heavy sledgehammer. 35 pounds of iron on a wooden handle. Right now, this was his main weapon.
The assistant, Senior Sergeant Rodenkov, grabbed a crowbar and spare track pins. They opened the emergency hatch in the floor. The hatch fell down into the greasy swamp sludge. The smell of dampness and burning burst inside. Nikiforov tumbled into the mud first. He crawled under the tank's belly, pressing himself to the ground so hard as if he wanted to soak into it. The 47-ton behemoth hung over him, giving a ghostly sense of protection. But they couldn't work under the belly. The track brake happened at the front, by the idler wheel. They would have to crawl out from under the tank. They would have to stand up. As soon as Nikiforov's head showed from under the fender, the world exploded with sounds. Inside the tank, sounds were muffled, like underwater. Here they were sharp, screeching, terrifying. Bullets clicked against the armor next to his face, striking sparks. Shrapnel sheared bushes. The air hummed. It was a lead downpour. The human body here was an alien element, soft flesh against red-hot metal. "Pull!" Nikiforov yelled, shouting over the roar. Rodenkov levered the heavy track link with the crowbar. One track link of a KV weighed dozens of pounds. The whole ribbon was an unliftable weight. They needed to pull the torn ends toward each other while suspended, standing knee-deep in a swamp under aimed enemy fire. Hands slipped. Mud, oil, blood from skinned knuckles, everything mixed together. From above, from the turret, the machine gun began to work. Kolobanov and Usov fired rapid bursts, sparing no ammo. They created a fan of lead, trying to suppress the German infantry that had already risen to attack. "Cut them off! Cut them off!" Kolobanov shouted. He couldn't see his mechanics. He only heard the blows of the sledgehammer on armor. Clang, clang, clang. This sound was the metronome of their life. As long as the sledgehammer banged, they were alive.
If the banging stopped, it meant it was all over. Nikiforov worked like a man possessed. He didn't feel the weight of the sledgehammer. Fear vanished, displaced by adrenaline fury. The track pin wouldn't fit into the eyelet. The metal was deformed by the explosion. He had to hit. Hard. Accurately. Every swing was a risk. When he raised his body for the strike, he exposed himself. Zip! A bullet passed an inch from his ear, burning his skin with the shockwave. Nikiforov didn't even flinch. He didn't have time. He hit the pin with the sledgehammer. 1, 2, 3. Sparks showered down his collar, but he didn't stop. "Come on, baby, come on," he rasped. It was a prayer to the mechanism. Rodenkov held the crowbar, his face distorted with strain. Veins on his neck bulged like ropes. He held the weight of the sagging track while Nikiforov drove the pin. If Rodenkov let go, the track would snap and crush Nikiforov's hands. This was absolute trust. The life of one in the hands of the other, in the most direct, physical sense. The ground around them boiled. A mortar shell fell 10 meters away. The blast wave threw mud into their faces, clogged eyes, mouths. Nikiforov spat out black sludge and raised the sledgehammer again. Strike. The pin went in halfway. Strike. A little more. Strike. The metal yielded. The tracks connected. Now they needed tension. The screw mechanism of the idler wheel tensioner. The wrench slipped. Nikiforov tore the skin off his palm to the meat, but there was no pain, only the task. He jerked the screw tight. The track pulled taut like a string. It was a single hole again.
It was ready to transmit torque from the diesel to the earth again. "Done! Into the machine!" Nikiforov yelled. The way back seemed longer than the way there. These 2 meters to the hatch in the floor were a marathon with death. The Germans saw the movement. Fire concentrated. Bullets hammered against the road wheels, ricocheted off the ground. Rudenkov dived under the belly first. Nikiforov dropped the sledgehammer. It wasn't needed anymore. It had done its job, and jumped after him. At the moment his boots disappeared into the hatch, a burst from a heavy machine gun hit the spot where he had stood. Mud flew up in fountains. Had he been a second late, he would have been turned into a sieve. They tumbled inside the tank, wet, dirty, shaking. Their chests heaved, gasping for stale air. They were alive. They had done the impossible. They repaired a tank under fire. Nikiforov, without saying a word, climbed into his seat. His hands, smashed to blood, lay on the levers. Now these weren't just levers. They were an extension of his nervous system. "Start it up!" Kolobanov commanded. The starter whined. The V2K diesel coughed smoke and caught. A mighty rumble filled the hull. It was the sound of life. Nikiforov engaged the gear. Smoothly, gently released the clutch. The tank jerked. The right track bit into the soil. The tank turned. It was controllable again. It was a predator again, not prey. "Let's go! To the alternate position!" the commander shouted. The 47-ton behemoth tore off. This wasn't flight. It was a maneuver. The tank that had just been a target turned into an elusive shadow. The crew felt a surge of wild, insane energy. They had cheated death. They had won a dice game against it, betting everything. Inside the tank, it smelled of the swamp the mechanics had brought in on themselves. This smell mixed with the smell of gunpowder, the smell of war, the smell of hard male labor that was done with quality and on time, despite the whole world trying to prevent it. The repair under a lead shower took no more than 10 minutes. But those 10 minutes cost them a year of life. Nikiforov's hair under the layer of mud had turned gray, but the track held. The pin, driven in by sledgehammer and fury, sat dead tight. Soviet steel, connected by Soviet will, doesn't break. The battle continued, and now the crew of the KV-1 had a personal score to settle with every German barrel that dared shoot at an unarmed man with a wrench. There would be no respite. The rumble of the diesel after the track repair had barely faded when the headphones of the helmet exploded with a new order. The voice on the air didn't just sound anxious, it sounded like a funeral toll. HQ wasn't congratulating them on the victory at Voiskovitsi. HQ demanded the impossible. Immediate redeployment. Destination, Maga Station. This short 3-letter word, Maga, was scarier to a knowledgeable man than any German tank wedge. It wasn't just a dot on the map. It was a railway junction, the last thread connecting Leningrad to the mainland. If the Germans took Maga, the city would be in a bag. The blockade ring would close. Millions of people would be in a deadly trap of hunger and cold. Kolobanov's crew understood this without political officers. Ideology wasn't needed here. Speed was needed here. "Start up! Full speed ahead!" Kolobanov commanded. The wounded, smoked-blackened KV-1, which had just survived clinical death, came alive again. The V2K engine roared, spewing clouds of black exhaust. The machine groaned. The transmission howled in high tones, complaining of overload. The metal was tired. Shock absorbers sagged, but there was no choice. A race against time began, where the prize was the life of an entire city. Driver-mechanic Nikolai Nikiforov squeezed everything the designers had put into the 47-ton machine out of it, and even more. Speed cross-country, 18 miles per hour. For a heavy tank, this was a gallop. Inside the hull, it felt like an earthquake. The tank was tossed on bumps. The crew flew around the fighting compartment, hitting the breech, the ammo rack, the instruments. No one counted bruises anymore. Pain became background noise that the brain simply filtered out. The coolant temperature crept into the red zone. Radiators were clogged with mud and dust. "We're overheating!" Nikiforov shouted, looking at the gauges. "Don't slow down!" Kolobanov chopped hard. "If we stop, Leningrad falls. Let the engine melt, but we have to be there." They were running on the limit of technical risk. Every kilometer was a game of Russian roulette with mechanics. Would a torsion bar snap? Would the main clutch hold, already smelling of burnt friction material? The torn and stitched together track clanked, reminding them of its unreliability. But it held. The brute force of Soviet iron dragged them forward. Inside the tank, men held on by pure stress biochemistry. They hadn't slept for 3 days. Their eyes were red from inflammation, lids heavy as lead. Hallucination started for everyone. The loader thought the shells were moving. The gunner saw flashes where there were none. To stay awake, they chewed dry crusts, bit their lips until they bled, slapped their cheeks. It was a zombie state where only one program remained: get there and shoot. The body drew on reserves that didn't exist in peacetime life. It was a loan from their own death at gigantic interest rates. On the road, they met retreating infantry, a heavy sight. Men walked dusty, tired, with dead eyes. They saw the huge KV rushing not to the rear, but toward the enemy, and a spark of hope appeared in their eyes. A tank is a symbol of strength. If tanks are going forward, then all is not lost yet. On one stretch, sappers clung to the armor. They also needed to get to the crossing. They covered the turret like ants. Kolobanov didn't drive them off. Infantry on armor meant extra eyes and extra guns. The sappers banged their rifle butts on the armor, greeting the tankers, but the crew inside didn't hear. They were in their own isolated world of noise and vibration. The road turned into mush. August rains and the tracks of hundreds of vehicles had broken the ground into liquid concrete. The tank swam in the mud, skidding. Nikiforov worked the levers like an oarsman on a galley. His hands, bandaged with dirty rags after the repair, were bleeding. Every movement of the lever required tens of pounds of effort. By the end of the march, he simply wouldn't be able to unclench his fingers. Comrades would have to pry them open. Smoke rose on the horizon. Warehouses at Maga station were burning. The Germans were close. They were breaking through to the railway line. The air trembled from cannonade. The KV-1 entered the combat zone on the move, without recon, without preparation. "Weapons ready," Kolobanov commanded. Usov pressed against the sight. The optics were cloudy, scratched, but through them the main thing was visible. Gray boxes of German tanks crawling toward the crossing. They were rushing to cut the artery. They didn't expect a Russian heavyweight to appear here, in the rear of their breakthrough. The element of surprise was on Kolobanov's side again, but now it wasn't an ambush. It was a meeting engagement. The most difficult, unpredictable type of tank combat. The tank flew onto the embankment. Tracks crushed ties. Rails rang under the machine's weight. The position was open, exposed, but the enemy was exposed too. "Armor piercing! Straight ahead!" the commander yelled. The race was over. The fight had begun. The crew, who had just been dying of fatigue, transformed instantly. Fatigue disappeared, burning up in the furnace of adrenaline. Movements became sharp, crisp. They were predators again. The KV-1 stood in the path of an entire Wehrmacht tank group tearing toward the Neva. It was alone. It was wounded. Its crew stayed on their feet only by the force of stubbornness. But to the Germans looking through their sights, it was an invincible monster appearing out of nowhere again. 76 millimeters of death looked them in the face. Kolobanov understood. There was nowhere to retreat. Behind them wasn't just Moscow. Behind them was the road of life, which hadn't even been built yet, but which already had to be defended. If they let the enemy through here, hundreds of thousands of Leningraders were doomed to starve to death. This thought was heavier than any shell. It pressed on their shoulders like a concrete slab, and this weight gave them no right to fear. The tank froze on the crest of the embankment, a black silhouette against a leaden sky. Shot. Flame from the muzzle brake tore the twilight. The first German tank, which had almost driven onto the rails, flared up. The road was blocked. Again. The logistics of war are cruel. They don't account for human resources. They operate only in tons and kilometers. But in this equation, there was a variable the German General Staff couldn't calculate. That was the will of 5 men locked in a steel box. A will that forced 47 tons of iron to move against the laws of physics and common sense. They made it. They plugged the breach with themselves. Now all that remained was to stand fast. The railway embankment wasn't just high ground. It was a springboard into the hell of a meeting engagement. The KV-1 didn't stay put, turning into a target. The 47-ton machine plunged down, breaking brush and small trees. This was no longer a methodical execution from ambush, as it was at Wojskowice. This was a rough contact brawl, where distances shrank to a grenade throw and tactics gave way to animal reflexes. There was no time to calculate lead here. The rule here was, whoever shoots first lives. Ahead, in the gray mist of twilight, a bridge was visible. A wooden deck over a narrow, swampy river. This bridge was the jugular vein of the defense. If the Germans crossed it or blew it up, the retreat route would be cut off and logistics strangled. Gray figures swarmed at the approaches to the crossing. Wehrmacht sappers. They were pulling wires, laying boxes of TNT. They were covered by tanks and anti-tank guns hastily deploying right in the mud. "Crush them!" Kolobanov roared. Driver-mechanic Nikiforov didn't take his foot off the gas pedal. The tank rushed toward the bridge like an enraged rhinoceros. Firing on the move for a KV-1 was ineffective. There were no gun stabilizers. The hull sway threw off the aim. But now accuracy was replaced by pressure. Kolobanov commanded to fire the machine guns. Tracer bullets from 2 DT machine guns stitched the twilight with threads of fire. The sappers on the bridge fell, failing to close the circuit. The boxes of explosives remained lying as useless cargo. A German Panzer III guarding the crossing tried to turn its turret, but its turret rotation speed lost to the closing speed of the Soviet giant. Nikiforov did what they didn't expect. He didn't stop for a duel. He went for a ram. Impact. 47 tons of Soviet steel at 18 miles per hour slammed into a 20-ton German tank. The sound of impact was terrible. It was a screech that made teeth vibrate. The German machine was thrown aside like an empty tin can. Its torsion suspensions snapped, a track tore off. The KV-1 went further, crushing the enemy's side with its momentum. "Short stop!" Kolobanov shouted. The tank braked sharply, nose dipping. This was a second for the gunner. Usov caught the anti-tank gun in the sight, its crew feverishly trying to aim the barrel. Range, 100 meters. Impossible to miss. shot. A high-explosive shell turned the gun and crew into bloody dust mixed with earth.
The gun shield flew into the air as a twisted sheet of metal. "Forward!" The tank tore off again. This was the jagged rhythm of death. Rush, stop, shot, rush. The engine worked at limit modes, oil temperature critical. Inside the fighting compartment, there was a roar that made noses bleed. But the crew was in a state of affect. It was a combat trance. The rage accumulated over 5 days of continuous fighting, for the fear, for fallen comrades, for burning villages, now spilled out through the breach of the F-32 gun. To the left, from behind cover, a German Stug self-propelled gun crawled out. Low silhouette, powerful frontal armor. It was dangerous. It could penetrate the KV. Usov saw it with peripheral vision. "Left! SPG!" The KV turret turned agonizingly slowly. It seemed an eternity passed while the barrel looked toward the enemy. The German fired first. The shell grazed the cheek of the KV turret, striking a shower of sparks and ricocheted away. The armor held, but the impact was so strong that Kolobanov hit his head on the commander's observation device. His vision went dark. "Fire!" he rasped, losing orientation. Usov fired back. The shell hit the Stug's superstructure. The ammo explosion blew the roof off the SPG. A pillar of fire rose to the sky. The score grew. Another unit, another one. In total, in this fleeting, furious battle at the crossing, the crew destroyed 8 targets. Tanks, guns, APCs. This wasn't the neat work of a sniper. It was the work of a butcher chopping from the shoulder, not caring where the blow landed, as long as the enemy fell. German infantry, seeing their armor turning into scrap metal, began to panic. The psychological effect of the appearance of an invulnerable monster crushing with tracks and burning with fire was stronger than any order. They ran. They dropped weapons, dropped wounded, jumped into the cold river water trying to swim away. The KV-1 rolled out onto the bridgehead fortification. Tracks slipped on casings and debris. Nikiforov turned the tank sideways, blocking the entrance to the bridge with his hull. Now the KV was a barrier, a steel, red-hot, shooting barrier. "Machine gun drums!" Rudenkov demanded. The loader handed over the last drums. Ammo was running out. 3 shells left. Fuel at the bottom of the tanks. But the mission was accomplished. The bridge was intact. They looked at each other in the dim light of the emergency bulb and didn't recognize faces. These were the faces of old men, carved with wrinkles of soot and dirt. Kolobanov looked at his watch. The hands were barely visible. Only half an hour had passed. Half an hour in which the fate of an entire sector of the front was decided. If they had been late, if Nikiforov hadn't squeezed the last juices out of the engine, if the armor hadn't withstood the ricochet, German tanks would already be on the other bank. The blockade ring would have closed here, and today. But it didn't close. "Kill it," the commander said quietly. The diesel sneezed and went silent. Cottony silence ensued. You could hear the metal cooling, crackling, and clicking. You could hear the water flowing under the bridge. This water flowed into Leningrad, and the road was open. The logistical artery pulsed. As long as trucks with bread and shells could go along it, the city would live. The crew didn't leave the machine. They simply had no strength to open the hatches. They sat in the dark, listening to life returning to their bodies. Muscle pain, ringing ears, thirst, all this rolled over them in a wave. But it was a good pain. It was the pain of living men. Outside on the battlefield, 8 bonfires were burning out. 8 steel graves for those who came here as conquerors. The KV-1 stood among them like a dark, soot-covered monument to itself.
The battle for the bridge was over, but the war was not. And the scariest thing for these men right now wasn't a new battle, but the realization that their feet would likely drown in a paper sea of reports and summaries, becoming just a dry line of statistics. 5 days of August were over. For history, it is a moment. For Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov's crew, it was a life compressed into an endless series of shots, heartbeats, and the smell of burning. They sat on the ground, leaning against the tracks of their cooling beast. The KV-1 was covered in scars. There wasn't a spot on the armor free of marks. Hundreds of hits, chips, dents, furrows from ricochets. The tank looked like a veteran who had gone through a meat grinder and came out the other side spitting metal teeth. The tankers' faces were gray, earthy, eyes sunken so deep they seemed like black holes. Hands trembled, couldn't hold a rolled cigarette. This wasn't the trembling of fear. It was the tremor of exhaustion. The body had burned all resources. Glucose, adrenaline, will. Everything went into those levers and wheels. They were silent. They had nothing to talk about. They knew everything about each other because they had seen each other in the moment when death peered into the vision blocks. The time came to tally the total. A dry accounting total, terrible in its scale. Over these days, Kolobanov's crew destroyed 43 German tanks, 43 combat vehicles, 11 guns, several companies of infantry. If you put this destroyed equipment in one column, it would stretch for kilometers. An entire Wehrmacht tank battalion ceased to exist thanks to the work of 5 men and 1 Soviet machine. It was a statistic impossible to believe. When the award citations landed on the table at Front HQ, the command's reaction was predictable. Shock, disbelief, skepticism. Staff officers sitting in clean tunics, hundreds of kilometers from the front line, looked at the numbers and shook their heads. "It's a mistake," they said, "or padding. One crew can't burn 43 tanks." It contradicted regulations, tactics, and common sense. The logic of war in offices differs from the logic of war in trenches. In offices, war is chess, where pieces have a strictly defined value. A pawn cannot eat a queen and half the board. It breaks the worldview. To admit such a result meant admitting that all their standards and calculations weren't worth the paper they were written on. It meant admitting that the outcome of a battle is decided not by numbers, but by the professionalism and will of specific individuals. Division Commander General Baranov signed a recommendation for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for every crew member. He was there. He saw the field at Voiskovitsy. He saw the burning carcasses. He knew the price of this lying impossibility. But the paper went upstairs, to Leningrad, to Moscow, and there, in the silence of high offices, a second battle took place. A battle of bureaucracy against heroism. A red pencil ruthlessly crossed out the award citations. Hero of the Soviet Union crossed out. Written, Order of the Red Banner. Gun Commander Usov, Order of Lenin. Driver Mechanic Nikiforov, Order of the Red Banner. Loader Kiselkov and Gunner Radio Operator Rodenkov, medals. Why? No one will explain. Maybe someone upstairs decided not to spoil them. Maybe they thought that in the difficult year of 1941, when the front was bursting at the seams, such victories looked suspicious. Or maybe just the envy of those who had never heard a slug hit armor played a role. The crew would find out about this later, and they wouldn't care. They didn't fight for stars on their chests. A gold star doesn't stop a shell. An order doesn't make armor stronger. Their reward was elsewhere. Their reward was that they were alive. That today, August 19th, German tanks didn't pass through Maga. That the blockade ring, which was ready to close on Leningrad's throat, didn't close right here and right now. They bought time, the most precious resource in war. A few days that allowed thousands of people to be evacuated, shells to be brought up, defenses to be strengthened. Kolobanov stood by his tank and looked at the horizon. He understood. This battle was just an episode. The war would be long, dirty, hard. There would be new battles, new wounds, new losses. Maybe they would die tomorrow. Maybe they would burn in the next attack. But what they did here was already written into reality. Not in paper reports, but in the earth itself, stuffed with German iron. 43 tanks. This was a number that should have become a legend, but it became a secret. Kolobanov's feet would lie on an archive shelf under the stamp "Secret" for many years, or simply get lost in the turmoil of the great tragedy. The country needed martyr heroes throwing themselves under tanks with grenades. Professionals who methodically, technically, without hysterics, destroyed the enemy and stayed alive, didn't fit the canon of the heroic epic of that time. A living hero is an inconvenient hero. He can tell how it really was. About the fear, about the dirt, about the confusion, about how scary it is to burn in an iron box. But memory is a stubborn thing. It breaks through the concrete of oblivion like grass through asphalt. The KV-1 tank, wounded but undefeated, became a monument to itself. Not a pedestal in a square, but a workhorse of war that performed its function 150%. The story of Kolobanov's crew is not a story about a miracle. It is a textbook of professionalism. It is proof that a man merged with a machine, knowing his business and keeping a cool head, is capable of breaking the spine of entire armies. It is the triumph of the engineering genius that created the KV and the human spirit that breathed life into that steel. The war would end 4 years later. Kolobanov would survive. He would go through all the circles of this hell. But that August of '41 would stay with him forever. As the highest point of tension, as the moment when he and his men made the impossible routine. Right now, they were simply sleeping. Right on the ground by the tracks. Blackened, deafened, deadly tired. They didn't know they had performed one of the most effective tank battles in world history. They just followed orders. Hold the line. And they held it. And glory is smoke. It dissipates as quickly as powder fumes after a shot. Only the fact remains. The enemy did not pass. And that is enough.